Welcome to today's session. It's the third in our series of Better Words webinars. Today we're going to be talking all about working with writers. Just to introduce myself, my name's Sam Russell. I'm one of the senior writers at ReadWords, and I'm also joined by Samuel Pollen, our Deputy Creative Director.
Hello.
And Orla Wood, another one of our senior writers.
Hi there.
So I know lots of you have joined these sessions before and are familiar with how they work. For the newbies on the call, I just wanted to explain what we're going to do and then tell you a little bit about ourselves before we get into the real meat of today. We're going to talk for about half an hour and talk through lots of different aspects of working with writers. We'll then have 15 minutes at the end to answer any questions you might have. So during the session, if you could enter any questions into the chat function at the top there, Orla will then pick those up and kind of share at the end the most interesting, relevant, or kind of frequent questions that keep on cropping up. You'll have seen that we've put you all on mute as you join the call. That feels slightly rude, I guess, but we've got quite a few people today, so we just want to cut out any of that feedback noise that can kind of interrupt a session like this. So if you could stay on mute, that would be great. We'd really appreciate it. Okay, a little bit about us. Again, this is mainly for the people who haven't joined these sessions before. We're ReadWords. We're a brand writing agency based in London, and we like to think that we give the world's brightest words. What we mean by that are words that are strategic and insightful and well thought through, but also words that are creative and bright and kind of eye-catching. We think those two things together, that's how you get kind of compelling language and kind of compelling writing. There's a team of 10 of us, some writers, some client services people, and we do all sorts of aspects of brand language. We do things like naming, where we obviously come up with a name for a new brand or find a new name for a company that wants to rebrand. We do your traditional copywriting, kind of brochures, advertising. That's a large bucket, and it covers lots of different types of writing. Obviously, we do lots of UX and digital writing as well, where we'll help a digital service or a digital experience kind of use language in an effective way. And we do brand voice, and sometimes that's called verbal identity, but that's helping a brand figure out how should it sound, how should it use language, what's the right voice to present to the world. And we do this for all sorts of people like Formula One and Tesco and lots of arts and culture organisations as well. Okay, I think that's enough of that. On to today's session. So today we're going to talk about working with writers. We're going to walk through three different parts of that process. The first is obviously, how do you find a writer? How do you make sure that the writer that you're working with is the right one and is going to get what you need? Then how do you brief them? That really critical moment where you set a writer up to kind of complete the job. How can you give them the information they need? How can you make that as clear and as useful as possible? And then afterwards, once they've actually developed something and you've had a read through, how do you give feedback in a way that, again, feels useful and sort of actionable, so that your writer has the best chance to kind of address any feedback or amends you might have? Before we get into that, we just wanted to talk a little about why we've chosen this topic. We work with lots of different people at ReadWords. We work with designers and strategists and marketers, museum curators. Some of those people work with writers all the time. Some of those people hardly ever work with writers. And I think sometimes can find the sort of process of working with a writer slightly opaque and slightly sort of mysterious. So drawing on our experience, we'd like to set out some of the ways we think you can make that relationship as kind of productive and happy and as successful as possible. Likewise, I know we've got a lot of other copywriters on the call. Hopefully this session will be useful for you to kind of borrow any tips or tricks we might have in kind of getting the best out of that relationship and kind of keeping clients happy and getting good work out of it as well. So we're going to move on to finding your writer. And for that, I'm going to hand over to Sam.
Thanks, Sam, and hello everyone. Yeah, so this is obviously a big question, and it probably starts with how do you know that you need a writer? You know, when do you actually need this person in the room? I think traditionally writers are often involved in a way where they are doing the execution, they are doing the final piece of, you know, the final gloss on whatever you're doing. Actually, we find that a lot of our work happens a long time before that, and that often the end result is better. Because of that, I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail, but involving writers in that process and kind of shaping the end product is something that we do a lot of, and I think lots of writers can contribute to. Ultimately, everything you do in a business happens in words. You know, you write a strategy in words, you write your business plan in words, you talk to each other in words every day. That sounds like an obvious and slightly dumb point, but it's really important to remember that, you know, words define everything you do in a business, and therefore they can shape the process. They can shape how you get to whatever end result you're getting to. If you find yourself asking questions like this within your business, you know, did we all, you know, when we were talking about that in the meeting, did we all mean the same thing? And are we on the same page now? Do we know what we're doing next? How do I sell this in to someone else within my business? Those are kind of questions that you don't necessarily think of a writer helping with, but we help businesses with those all the time, and I think lots of other writers do, and that can be something to bear in mind when you're thinking about, do I need a writer to help? A question we get asked a lot by clients is this one, which is, can you finesse our strategy? You know, we've done this, but we just need you to sort of polish it. And you know, we obviously love to help with that kind of problem, but I think it's worth bearing in mind that at that point, decisions have already been made, and when a writer is changing the words of something, which is what you're asking them to do, they're also going to change the meaning of it. There's no way to change how something is written without changing what it means. And if that thing is something like your whole business strategy, your whole brand strategy, something big and strategic for your business, that's a problem, because that thinking about the exact word should have happened at the start of that process. This an illustration of the fact that, you know, we normally we more and more with clients, we're working earlier and earlier in that process. But I think this is quite common. I think the writers on this call will probably get what I mean by this graphic. It's a Gantt chart showing where a writer is normally brought in, and that means that they can only affect the end result so much, right? They haven't been there for those conversations that have shaped it. They don't know what went on to get to the point they're at. It limits the contribution they can make, and that's true of all specialists. You know, the earlier they're involved, the more they can do. Ultimately, they can only help from the point that you involve them. And just another way of illustrating that point, I think you've probably seen this. This isn't just about writers. This is about all kinds of specialist roles, particularly creative roles. You can have something done well. You can have something done very quickly. You can have something done cheaply. It's hard to achieve all of those things together. Now, this isn't like a perfect equation. I don't think, you know, creative processes aren't exactly linear. The more time you spend, the better the result is. But I always think this is worth bearing in mind when you're sort of planning a project. You think, oh, well, if we hand it over to the writer at that point, you know, that very phrase of like hand it over, it rings alarm bells for me, because actually this, you know, this should be a collaborative process, and the earlier those people know about what you're doing, the more they will be able to contribute to what you're doing. We get asked a lot about experience. So people say things to us like, I need someone who's a specialist in the organic beauty sector. I need someone who's written dozens of this, you know, of things for this specific market before. That's a consumer example. It's also true in B2B. People will, you know, need someone who knows insurance like the back of their hand, or knows private equity really well, or whatever it is. And that's, you know, not doing down specialist experience. That's very useful, but we often kind of question that. And we're lucky enough to work in an agency where we have got an experience of lots of kinds of different jobs. But I would generally say that, you know, specialist experience is not necessarily the thing you should be looking for. You should be looking for someone who is really good. And, you know, there are fields where having a specialist body of knowledge is crucial. So if you're writing kind of medical marketing literature for doctors, right, you need to know the science. Someone can't substitute for that. But most of the time, for most brands, what you need is a really good writer. The other point to make there, I think, is that you are the specialist in what you do. You have expertise in your field. Hiring someone who has the expertise in your field that you already have doesn't feel like a smart decision to me. You know, you want someone who is the expert in translating what they hear from you to the audience and kind of bridging that gap, so they can turn it into something that the audience understands. They're a fresh pair of eyes. They're someone who is outside of your world, and that's part of the value a writer can bring. So that question specialism can, I think, lead you down the wrong path sometimes. So all of that said, you want someone good. You want to pick a good writer. How do you do that? How do you judge what's good? Well, just to flip around what I just said, just as your writer doesn't necessarily need to be an expert in what you do, it's also true that you shouldn't have to be an expert in what the writer does. Writers probably won't love me for saying this, some writers, but the good writers are not the only judges of what good writing is. And you're looking for someone who can do something that you are happy with and you think works for your audience. So the question I think you should ask yourself is, do I like what I'm looking at? Do I like if they show me a portfolio of work? Does it speak to me? Do I like the work I see? And do other, I think ask around in your network, look around, do other people recommend that person? Ask people who they've worked with, why they liked working with them. I think there's nothing better than referrals, because actually it can be very hard to see what the process of working with a writer is going to be like. We get asked about sort of test briefs a lot, and I think sure lots of writers get that question, and kind of that seems like a sensible place to start. I think it's a really good decision to if you can pick a small piece of work that is a test for your writer, and is that it kind of sees, so you can see how that relationship is going to be. What we caution against is kind of an artificial test brief. So you have 1 week to come up with an idea to impress, is the kind of classic pitch situation. And the problem with that is that the people who do it best are the ones who will have free time that week. You don't really know what the relationship of actually working with that person is going to like, because that artificial brief that you've set is not like the actual working experience that you want to have with that person. You again run into that problem that we showed you earlier, which is, you're asking someone to do something quickly, and you're asking someone to do something that isn't necessarily representative of what you want. So how useful actually is that for judging their work? There's then a kind of thorny question that we wanted to cover in this because I think it's something a lot of people struggle with. But how do you construct this relationship? I.e., how do you pay this writer, and how does that work day to day? Lots of writers will work to day rates, and that's kind of simple enough. We tend to, as an agency, tend to work to project fees, and like more and more writers, I think, do that. When I say a project fee, what I mean is you pay a set sum of money for the product. So you want someone to write a website for you. You tell them how many pages it's going to be. You tell them how many words are involved in that. Not literally necessarily the word count, but the kind of amount of work involved, and they will give you a fixed fee for that. We tend to work that way. We believe in working that way, and the reason for that is because it ultimately judges the work based on what you actually need. So you need the website. How much are you willing to invest in that? How important is it for your business? It accepts that most businesses have fixed budgets for stuff. They can't necessarily spend an unlimited amount on the things that they are doing. It's honest, so you don't have that situation where you're, oh well, that day actually didn't you leave early to go to a doctor's appointment, so is that a full day? There's lots of kind of awkwardness that comes from day rates, and we find that generally that way of working is a better reflection of the work we're doing, but also saves a lot of arguments. Just to illustrate that point, so this is Benjamin Franklin's working day. At 5 a.m. he rose, washed, and addressed the powerful goodness, right? And then he did a solid 8 hours work and achieved a lot of things in his lifetime. Hunter S. Thompson, also a brilliant writer, also did some great stuff. Got up at 3:05, he had a whiskey and a cigarette. By 4:30, he'd had 3 lines of cocaine. And those are both, working days of great writers, but they're very different. Now, obviously, most writers you work with, ourselves included, probably don't work in quite that way, but I think it illustrates the point that days are a really mutable, difficult thing to judge, and actually what you should probably be judging is the work you're going to get out of it. There are exceptions to that. There's situations where it makes sense to think about the time rather than the kind of overall project. If you need someone to be in the room, you need a writer to be there with you 3 days a week. Not right now, obviously, but generally, then it makes sense to pay them by the day. Also, if you've got a big thing that you need to produce that is going to have lots of execution, but you don't quite know how much. I'm thinking you're working with a large organization and they need a help section for their website, and you don't know how much that's going to be, but you need someone there to work through a big chunk of content. Then a day rate might make sense. Also, if you're working with Benjamin Franklin, you're probably going to get quite good value out of that, so I'd go for the day rate. But generally, we reckon project fees are the way to work with writers. We've written a blog post about that, which we will share in in our follow-up blog, so you can have a look at kind of a fuller argument for why we think that's the way to go. I'm going to hand back over to Sam now, who's going to tell you a little bit about, once you've found this perfect writer, this brilliant person for your project, how do you brief them?
Great, thank you. So yes, so the brief sets up the whole job and gives the writer that direction to do a good job. How do you give them the information and the direction that they need to make that happen? Well, we think there are a few ways that you can do that. Some of them might sound incredibly obvious, but we often find that they go missing in a process. So the first one is really to talk to your writer, and by that I mean have a conversation. Written briefs are great and useful and good for lots of things, like nailing down key messages, product specifications, deadlines, audiences, all the sorts of things that you want your writer to consider when they're writing something. You know, they're useful because your writer has something to refer back to throughout the process. And it's also useful for you to have something that you can judge their work against and kind of measure how successful they've been. But a written brief often misses out a lot of the intangibles that a writer kind of gets a lot of value from. Things like, what do you as a client think good writing looks like? Are there any brands, organizations, individual writers that you respond to and resonate to, that you think do a great job, that you'd like the writer to kind of consider? What's worked before in other relationships you might have had with writers, whether that's internally in the organization, outside with freelancers? You know, what are the things that you've found really worked for the way that you kind of think about language? And then how do you and your new writer want to work together? Often this stuff isn't kind of contained within a written brief, but in a phone conversation, in a Zoom conversation, more and more, that's when you kind of tease that sort of information out. And I know, speaking for myself, I always feel more confident in the job that I'm about to do when I've had a chat with the person who's briefing it. If you're working with, say, an agency and there's kind of an intermediary there, that's also fine. But the closer you can get to the original client, the person that's setting the brief, the person that's going to be reviewing the work, then the better you are, I think, equipped to do a good job. Within that conversation, within that brief, I think it's important to try and be as specific as possible. And that's a really hard thing to do, I think, for language, because words are so slippery and they can mean so many different things to different people. It's often hard to kind of pin down exactly what you want from your writer. But I think if you can focus, first of all, on the messages, what is the content that you want this piece of writing to talk about? And then the tone, how do you want it to sound? If you can focus on those two elements, you've given a writer basically everything they need to kind of get that first draft going and to keep it on track with your expectations. So let's imagine we were briefing a writer to write about a new bottled water brand. The moment we open our mouths and the moment we say this, the writer is going to have a flurry of different questions, like what kind of water, still or sparkling, flavored or natural, sourced locally, flown in from Fiji, what kind of bottle, polyethylene, biodegradable, question after question after question. The reason why they're asking these questions is because they're looking for, what's the hook that I'm meant to write around? What's the kind of main thing that I'm going to build my piece of writing around? If I've got that, I feel more confident about setting off. Without it, I'm probably going to write something that's very confused and a kind of a jumble of lots of different messages, which isn't going to work with the audience. Or I'm going to have to fall back on generic kind of stereotypical approaches to talking about bottled water, which means that it'll sound exactly like Evian and every other bottled water brand out there. So the more you can answer these questions for your writer, the better prepared they'll be. And I appreciate sometimes these questions will be, might come to you as a surprise. You might not have thought about them yourself. That is the benefit of a writer, I think, is that you have this partner that you now have to kind of throw ideas around and bounce things back and forth and kind of figure out what exactly those key messages are. Likewise, that's content, that's your messaging. Now, tone. This is something you hear a lot, I think, when you're a writer. We'd like it to sound human. And you can kind of see the attraction there of a word like human, because it feels sort of big and universal and kind of powerful. The tricky thing is that word is open to so many different interpretations. So for a writer, it's not really enough to tell them you want something to sound human, because they could go in so many different directions. For example, they might say, well, what kind of human, I have 7 billion options to choose from. Am I writing in the persona of, say, a heavy metal fan or the CEO of a major financial organization? Those are two very different voices that will work for different audiences. Both of them are humans. How should I kind of pin this down? What information can you give me to kind of make that word, that brief, more useful? One of the ways that you can do this, and I think it's a pretty simple one, is just to share examples that you like or that you think respond to a particular word like human. Likewise, examples that you think don't work and actually you don't want them to kind of, you want your writing to be as far away from them as possible. So let's say we're asking someone to write something that sounds human. We might share an example like this. This is an advert from TSB, UK retail bank. Welcome back to local banking. Now that language is simple and warm. There are no frills. There's no kind of wordplay. It's very straightforward. Is that the sort of human that you want? Or do you want sort of innocent smoothies, kind of cheeky, slightly playful, humorous kind of approach to language? That feels very kind of warm and engaging. Is that the sort of human you want? Or do you want Converse's approach to language, which feels kind of spiky and aggressive and a bit kind of dirty? Shoes keep it clean, sneakers get dirty. Is that something that you want your writer to consider? The more examples you can share with them, the better picture they'll have of what you're looking for when you talk about tone, because they could go in lots of different directions. So again, as many examples as possible, and they don't just need to be adverts. If it's a tweet or a speech or anything, if it's got words in, it's going to be useful to showing your writer exactly what you think this piece of writing should sound like. Before we move on to giving feedback, this is something that we also tend to hear quite a lot. We'd like to sound like Apple. That's a very laudable ambition, but often what people mean is we'd really like to be Apple. And actually the way we think about language is very different from the way that Apple thinks about language. There's nothing particularly interesting, we think, in the way that Apple use language. It's just we want to be as cool and as popular as them. So if you are sharing an example, really ground it in language, ground it in words, because that's what your writer's going to respond to. That's what they're going to look to for direction. It's not quite enough just to say, we want to be like X. Tell them why, show them an example of that. Okay, so you've set them up for success. You've given them that clear brief. They've gone away, they've written something, and you've got some thoughts about it. And now you need to give them feedback. What's the best way to do that? How can you make that as useful as possible? Well, first of all, I think the thing to say is, don't hold back. Feedback is a natural process in writing. Writers are used to it every day. I think it's much better to really say what you think, and if you really don't like something, then it's much more useful to a writer for you to say that up front rather than kind of slightly talk around or dance around a subject. So get as much feedback on the table as possible. Think to yourself, what's my gut reaction to this piece of writing? What catches my eye? What gives me a slightly allergic reaction? Are there any words or phrases that when you read them you think, yikes, we would never say that, our brand would never use that, our organization would never use that? Once you've got that gut reaction, it's really useful to a writer if you can kind of explain why that reaction, where's that reaction coming from? So show them and tell them why you've had this kind of response to their writing. It's really useful, I think, sometimes to bring your audience into this. So whoever you're writing for, imagine what would they think if they saw this piece of writing. Maybe it's mass market communication, so it's going out to lots of consumers. Maybe it's going out, maybe you're writing a fundraising letter. Maybe it's to kind of colleagues, whoever the audience is, bring them into the room and kind of imagine what would they think of this piece of writing. Because it's really hard, I think, judging a piece of writing. It's a really subjective thing sometimes. So the more objectivity you can bring to it, the better. And your audience and thinking about how it's going to land with your audience is a useful way to bring that objectivity in. And then there's always the overnight test, which again, I think is something that's really valuable and occasionally goes missing because we're all pressed to get things done as quickly as possible. When you first read a piece of writing, you'll have that gut reaction. If you can come back to it overnight or 5 minutes later, 30 minutes later, you're probably going to have a slightly more considered, kind of detailed analysis of that piece of writing, which is really what the writer is looking for to be able to do a good job in the next round. So in the same way that giving a brief is all about as being as specific as possible, I think giving feedback follows the same principle, really. So the more you can highlight specific bits of language, the better and more useful you're being to your writer. So it's really natural to have these sorts of responses to a piece of writing. I'm not sure, I don't like it, it's not working. That's the kind of gut reaction that we all have when we read something. But then how can you move things on a step further? Because as it stands, we've not really given our writer enough to go away and do a second draft. So let's say we've briefed someone to do that bottled water brand, and they've come back to us with this very short description of the brand, who it is, what it does. Aqua Plus is engineered to provide long-lasting refreshment. Every glug replenishes your body's essential salts and electrolytes. And we read this and we thought, it's not quite right. It's not exactly what we thought we were going to get. But how can we give that feedback in as useful way as possible? Well, we probably wouldn't say this, or at least we wouldn't only say this. We'd want to go into why it's not working. So it's not working because, well, first of all, there's a messaging problem here. We're focusing too much on the physical benefits, on the replenishing salts and electrolytes, and we're not focusing on the emotional benefits, the way that the product makes the customer feel when they drink it. And the tone doesn't feel right to us. It feels inconsistent. We're using a slightly odd mix of words, which together create a slightly confused tone and a slightly confused sense of who the brand is. Now, if we can go one step further and actually highlight specific elements within a bit of copy, that's really useful to a writer, because the risk is always that they'll go away and misinterpret something, can kind of focus on the wrong thing when really you want to draw their attention to this. So let's highlight the messaging that isn't working. You know, here we're talking about the fact that there are physical benefits, but actually we want to talk about the emotional benefits and the way that it makes someone feel and what it allows them to do. And likewise with the tone, let's really identify those words and phrases that don't feel quite right to us. So scientifically engineered, for example, that feels a very technical, slightly cold piece of language, which might be right if we're a very scientific brand. But then we're also using the word glug, which is much more kind of colloquial and informal. That's the sort of word you might expect innocent smoothies to use. And when you put those two things together, you get a very strange picture of what this brand is about. So by highlighting those words, you're kind of really making it clear to your writer the different elements that you want them to look at. And this is one of the hardest things to do, I think, particularly if your organization is a large one and you're working with lots of different people, is to consolidate that feedback and make it as kind of single-minded as possible. We often hear this sort of thing at Read Words. We need to share it with marketing, comms, HR, legal, product. You know, the list is almost infinite sometimes of the number of people that need to be involved in reviewing and approving a piece of writing. That's a really tricky thing to do, I think, to manage all those people and to manage that feedback. But really the goal here is to consolidate that feedback and make it as useful as possible for the writer so that they can get it right next time round. So let's go back to our glug example. You know, this is not terribly useful feedback to a writer, because we have some people saying that they like it because it sounds energetic and punchy. We've got other people saying they hate it because it reminds them of a sports drink and not a kind of premium still water. We've got another person coming at the end talking about, well, isn't that right for our audience? These are all really useful conversations, and they're often conversations that your writer can help facilitate and kind of be the kind of the external third party that helps people come to a decision. But as it stands, this is not useful feedback. We need to come to some decisions before the next draft happens, because if someone starts writing based on this feedback, the next draft is going to be confused and nobody's going to be happy with it. So the more we can consolidate that feedback, the better. Okay, I'm going to hand back to Sam now, who's going to quickly recap the things we've talked about, and then we're going to hand over to Orla, who hopefully will have some questions for us.
Thanks, Sam. So yeah, just to recap what we've been through, that process of finding the writer, the first thing you need to do, remember that they can help you maybe earlier than you might expect, and having them as part of that thinking process can be really valuable. So start earlier than you intended to, and structure that work in a way that allows you to get the most out of them, and is based on the product you need to get to, rather than the kind of, you know, the mechanics of a working relationship. On briefing, so we recommend written brief and a conversation. Both of those things are really important for capturing the tone of what you want to say, but also the kind of detail. They're going to ask you questions, or a good writer will ask you lots of questions. They might ask you questions that you think are stupid questions. That's because they're trying to, you know, go through everything that they may need to consider, that the audience may think of when they're engaging with you, when they're trying to find out about you. And most importantly, share examples. You know, make that conversation practical and focused. Come to that conversation with what you want the end result to look like. And then when you're giving feedback, firstly, be direct. It's be very direct. Writers are used to hearing honest feedback on their writing. It's much better for them to have a clear, I don't like X because, than it is to go, oh, I'm not sure, it's just, yeah, maybe it'll work. They'd much rather have that clarity of a kind of honest conversation. And make sure you've had that conversation internally before you take it to the writer, or involve them in that, but understand that if you have your head of marketing and your head of brand and your CEO all disagreeing about the right way forward, they're not going to be able to resolve that for you. That's a question of politics rather than a creative questioning. Explain that reasoning and kind of come with a clear point of view as much as possible. So that's kind of what we've covered today. We'd love to answer some questions. Paula, how are we doing on that?
Yeah, great. Thanks for your questions so far, everyone. Please keep putting them in the chat box. Richard has a couple of questions. The first one was on the practicalities of finding a good writer. What can you do beyond trusting someone's word of mouth recommendations to find a good writer?
Shall I start, Sam?
Sure, yeah, go for it. That's a really tricky one. So I'll leave that one.
I managed to look ahead at the question that was there. I had a sneaky look. Yeah, it's really hard, and it's easy for us to kind of say it from the position of a writing agency to say, oh, we can find someone you really like, but that's a tricky thing to do. A couple of things. Firstly, you can find out who was behind things that you like. If you're doing that process of looking for work that speaks to you and that is close to the result you want to get to, you can often on creative networks where there's things like The Drum where people post work that they've done, or also you can just get in contact with companies and ask them who did that for them, and find out that way who the people behind work that you really like were. Secondly, there's a network called The Dots, and there's various other similar things where lots of creative people of all kinds of specialisms, whether they're designers or writers or whatever else, will post portfolios of work, so you can quickly look at a lot of what a lot of different people are doing in one place. So yeah, I know it's not easy, but I think a bit of active searching can lead you to a better writer than just kind of waiting for them to come to you.
And I think to the point about portfolios, I would really be guided by those more than anything else, more than years of experience or where someone's worked. I think if you like even just a handful of examples in someone's portfolio, you can be confident that even if it might not be your thing or kind of within your sector, that they're going to do a good job. So that's why I think test briefs sometimes aren't quite necessary, because you can usually tell from what a writer's done previously the way they think about language and what you're going to get as an end result.
Great. Lucy has had a similar question on that theme, which was about finding the right writer for your organisation. He says that he finds most writers these days are using a very colloquial tone, which isn't right for his company, and he'd be more comfortable with someone who can write in a more formal voice.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. I think I think a good writer should be able to flex, and they should be able to pretty comfortably write in that more colloquial kind of everyday tone, and then something that feels more formal. Obviously, the way to tell that is just examples. So if someone within their portfolio has written for, a sports drink, but also a private equity firm, and they've done a nice job with both of them, and both feel compelling and engaging and all those sorts of things that good writing is, then you can probably be confident that no matter how formal your brand is or the way that you think about language, that they're going to be able to meet that expectation.
I'm not sure I have a huge amount to add to that. Yeah, that's a really good answer. I think I would definitely agree with that point, that even if the work that they share, lots of people want to put the most fun things in their portfolio, and that's quite a natural thing to do. It doesn't mean that they can't write in a voice that is more formal. So I'd encourage you to have that kind of conversation openly and say that up front to people, and then see where you get to from that.
Great. Richard had another question about what you should do if a writer says that the whole project needs to be rewritten. If you've got a writer on board to just write a small piece, what would you do in that situation if it was sort of too far down the line to redo the whole thing?
Interesting.
Yeah, I guess the first thing I'd say would be probably need to interrogate that a bit. What are they actually saying there? Because it feels like as a top line thing, that was obviously isn't terribly useful. I don't know the detail of that situation, but I imagine that digging into that and going, well, okay, well, what are the problems? Can you break it down a bit for me? Because there might well be low hanging fruit, that there's things that you can change quite quickly that are going to not, we don't live in a perfect world. You can't necessarily always start everything from scratch, but you might be able to change a few things that have a big impact quite quickly. So I'd dig into that question further. And again, I think it's really about asking questions and having that conversation, an open, honest, kind of direct conversation is normally the path to a sort of better result in the end.
And to me, that feels like almost the writer's gut reaction when they see what they're working on. They think, oh goodness, this all needs to start again. I think actually if you'd want your writer to consider it a bit more, and as Sam said, look for those quick fixes and quick wins that they can do, because it's not a perfect world, and even if a writer's able to do kind of 5% or 10% of what they would like to do in kind of a perfect world, then that will often kind of improve things a lot.
Great. Graham, who's a fellow copywriter, I believe, was just saying that good briefs are a rarity these days. So I was wondering, sort of on that topic, if a client sort of comes to you with a blank slate, is there a way that you can sort of collaborate to shape the brief together?
Yeah, definitely. I think so. I think actually that's really what that conversation is useful for, because the written brief might say something like, we want to be bold and exciting and all those sorts of things. And then in that conversation, that's when you tease out, what exactly does that mean? How are we going to talk about our water brand in that way? I think shaping the brief with the client is something that a writer should do. And often that's why, if you've just got the written brief, or if you're working with an intermediary, you don't quite have that opportunity. Yes, I think that is definitely something that a writer should be doing. And you should, after that conversation, you as the client should come away with a slightly different view of how things are going to work out, I think, or kind of have a slightly change in perspective, I think.
Yeah, whenever we go to meet a new client, one of the things I say is that I kind of foreground the fact that I'm going to ask them lots of really stupid questions. And I'm asking those questions not necessarily because sometimes it is because I'm really stupid, but often it's because what I want to do is get them to construct the argument for me and kind of really break that down, so that I can build it up in a way that is actually going to speak to the audience. I think there's a lot of preconceptions about what people know about a business. So I kind of foreground that thing that I'm going to ask lots of questions, so that then becomes a justification for me spending quite a lot of time really digging into what they want, and what the ins and outs of it are, in a really kind of thorough and methodical way.
Mm-hmm. And often clients will come to us with some personas or perhaps brand archetypes. I was wondering how you felt how useful they are when it comes to shaping a brief for a writer.
Yes. So things like we've had things in the past where a client will say, we really want this brand to sound like a particular, say, Hollywood actor, or we think this brand kind of conforms to the Jungian archetypes of being a wizard and a whatever. I think those things are really useful as a foundation, but the next question is always, well, what does that mean for language? Because it's great that you might want your brand to sound like Brad Pitt, but what is it about the way that Brad Pitt uses language, or the way that Brad Pitt sounds, that is useful for me? Because otherwise I might have a very different impression of Brad Pitt to you, and I'm going to go away and do something that doesn't quite fit that vision. So yeah, I think those things could be useful conversation starters. But I think that there's the next step, that, okay, what does this mean for language? What's useful? What can I give the writer as kind of fuel for the next stage?
I think that's I always think of the thing, if you've seen like an actor in one movie, you often have a portrait of them that's based on that character. And that can be, so that conversation about what that actually means to that person is really important. Do you mean Olivia Colman in Peep Show, or do you mean Olivia Colman as the Queen in The Favourite? Because those are two very, very different people, and I think it's important to dig into that as much as possible.
Yeah, and I think on that point, I would actually, I think that's why actors are a really tricky personas to build voices and language around, because as Sam said, you're kind of like, well, I don't actually know what the real Olivia Colman or the real Brad Pitt sounds like. I'm only basing it on a handful of movies I've seen. So yes, I think often they're not the most useful personas to give a writer to work from.
Great. Another question from Richard on how we manage clients' expectations at the beginning of a project or a relationship. Tips on how to do that well.
Interesting. I think it's that conversation really, and figuring out exactly, getting as close as you can to the image that a client has in their head of what this is going to sound and turn out like. Because the more you can get that, the more you're able to tell as a writer, look, we're not, this quite dry thing is never going to sound as kind of exciting or as zippy as you want it to. So that's a way that you can manage your expectations. Or you can say, well, we're never going to be able to reach that audience, so why don't we think about it like this? So the more the client can bring to that conversation, the better you are able to judge whether it's realistic, whether it's going to work, whether you should be doing something else instead. So yeah, I think getting all that out as early as possible is incredibly useful.
I think it also, there's a really interesting conversation to be had there about like the process you're actually going to go through. So if we're working on a digital project, it might often be that we work in a quite iterative way. So we will do a very rough, this is roughly what it might look like, let's develop from there. So they're going to see something that is not finessed from a copy point of view. The words aren't perfect, but it's about a starting point, because it's about informing that process of the development of an interface or an app or whatever it is. Whereas like the kind of more traditional creative industry model, I guess, is we will perfect this thing and then wow you with this beautiful presentation, and that will be that will knock your socks off, but you won't necessarily have been invested along the way in the creation of that until you see the big reveal. Now, I think both of those are good models for different situations, but it's useful having a conversation up front about which of those models you're following and why, so that kind of people's expectations of what you're going to show them and how they should judge that are really clear.
Great. So I think we probably have time for one last question. We'll go to Kat, who had a question speaking from a freelance perspective. If we had any tips on pressing for final payment. I know this is a problem that the freelancers often will have, and if we had any tips on perhaps how to word that third reminder email or how best to get clients to pay up.
Yeah, that's really tricky.
It's a really tricky topic. My wife is a freelance journalist, so I feel your pain. We obviously have that problem as an agency as well sometimes, but it's particularly tricky for freelancers. The thing I'd say, just in case you may well already know about this, but just in case you don't, is late payment terms. So putting those on all of your invoices as standard. Because there is standard wording that HMRC has around late payments that you can put on your invoices, so that people know ahead of time that if they don't pay by a certain agreed date that's on your invoice, then they will have to pay more. And that can be, often you don't get the more, obviously, but it can be a really useful way to kind of put a point in time when you can go back and gently turn the screws. But I know how hard it is, and it's a real shame because it can often sour a very productive relationship, and it's a tricky thing to navigate.
Yeah, I think that's a really useful tip. And yeah, I think by the third time you've chased something, that's when you have to be in as direct and kind of pushy as possible. I think the kind of softly approach works maybe the first 2 times, but it might just be that someone's forgotten, people are busy, they've got lots of other things. So being as kind of clear and direct and say, this is when I need it by, and then something like late payment terms are, I think, a really useful way of kind of encouraging that along a bit.
Great.
Cool. Super. They were some really interesting questions. Thank you very much. I should say that this is the 3rd session we're running. Next week, we're going to do the final session of this series, and that's where we're going to look at building a brand voice. We've touched on some of those elements today, but that's when we'll investigate how do we read words, kind of do that. Why can it be tricky sometimes? How do you get kind of clients on board? How do you make it happen? How do you kind of embed a voice within an organization and a brand? So if you go to our Eventbrite page, you'll be able to register for that. And in the meantime, any questions, any follow-up questions you have about this session, we'd love to hear from you in all this variety of different ways. We're going to share a quick survey afterwards as well. It'll take 2 minutes. We would love to hear what you thought about it, and are there any other topics that you'd like us to cover on in future. But in the meantime, thank you very much for your time, and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, guys.